Okay, so I'm going to present a joint work with Rachel Guy and Claudia Olivetti. We have a research agenda that started quite a few years ago and hopefully is going ahead with more work on this topic. So we're going to be talking about gender change across 150 years of transformation in US hours. And then I would be used to call this kind of perspective a very long run perspective, but after yesterday's talk by Oded, who was talking about 300,000 years, I'm afraid the wow factor about our sample periods is just gone. So short-run perspective. So there is a very simple motivation for working on this topic. So basically, the increased involvement of women in the economy has been one of the most spectacular facts of labor markets in the 20th century. So we are many of us, I mean, the presentations I've seen yesterday and today, many of us are working on the increase in female participation and the remaining gender gaps. But then what we want to put the emphasis here is that this spectacular increase in women's participation to the labor market is not a universal phenomenon, it's not just a constant of universal history, because female employment has been falling during other time periods, not so far away, and also is still falling in other places in the world, outside the developed world. In particular, there is evidence that female work is non-monotonically developing with stages of economic development. So female employment tends to decline at early stages of development and then rise again in later stages of development. And these movements of sort of U-shaped female employment are very clearly linked to the evolution of the industry structure in the economy, most importantly, the decline in agriculture and the rise in the service economy. So what we do in this paper, we try to make sense of the different phases of the evolution in both women's and men's work, and we do that through the lens of structural transformation. By structural transformation, we mean the labor reallocation across the broad sectors of agriculture, manufacturing, and services, and accompanying the reallocation across agriculture, manufacturing, and services, there's also another kind of similarly conceptual allocation from the household to the market, from producing services in the home to producing similar services in the market, and we call that marketization of home production. We do that with a special focus on unpaid family work, which was the core employer of women in the early part of our sample period. So there's going to be a lot on this paper about unpaid female work. We're going to present a unified framework to make sense of these facts. So we will spend a lot of time on the facts, and then we present a framework that tries to make sense of this fact. The framework, we would like to argue, it's very simple. So basically, we have a multi-sector economy. The different sectors are characterized by uneven productivity growth and differential gender intensity. So uneven productivity growth feeds into gender trends that we will show in a minute through differences in female intensity, which may be due to comparative advantages, whether innate or acquired. It could be due to gender norms. It could be due to whatever reasons why women and men tend to work in systematically different parts of the economy. And we do that using historical evidence for the US from 1870 onwards. So in our approach, apologies, we build a consistent measure of market work by gender in the US, and we combine intensive and extensive margins. So we want to cover both people in work, on which there is already some patchy evidence, and also working hours. And we argue that the intensive margin, which is largely under research, is extremely important to understand the trends in female work. So putting everything together, we find that market work is U-shaped for women, but with a relatively sort of shallow U-shape, kind of shallower than what you would get, only looking at extensive margin, and declining throughout for men. In the framework that we present, the male building blocks are like consumers and firms. Consumers prefer to consume a sort of varied consumption bundle. They are not willing to substitute agricultural produce with manufacturing or with services. They really favor variety over specialization. There is uneven productivity growth, and there are income effects. With these elements, we produce structural transformation and marketization. So the key points of the key predictions of the model is that there's going to be a decline in agriculture generated by the high growth rate in agriculture, which implies a fall in market work, because both men and women were working a lot in agriculture in the early decades. So the decline in agriculture represents a fall in market work. And later on, the marketization of home services, outsourcing the services from the home to the market, drives an increase in market work. And this happens for everybody, men and women. But the fact that men and women are differentially selected into these sectors implies that the decline in agriculture, where everybody was working at the turn of the 19th century, has very similar effects for men and women. However, the marketization of home services and the increase in market work associated with that mostly matters for women, because both home services and market services are very intensive in female work. This is what drives the U. Why there is no U for men? Because this later phase, which is characterized by the fall in the manufacturing sector and the increase in market services, is not enough to increase male market hours. Male market hours at the later stage, they bear the consequences of the industrialization, and at the same time, the increase in market services is not strong enough for men to offset the decline in hours due to the industrialization. So this is a bit what we do. Okay, there is some related work that we build upon and we hope to make a contribution to. Some is some early work on the U-shape hypothesis. The U-shape idea was hypothesized in early work by Esther Boserup, Claudia Golding, and others. And the idea is basically, I mean, there's lots of ideas in this early work that we try to sort of inherit a model in our framework. So the idea is, of course, that men and women were working a lot in agriculture. Women were especially unpaid workers in agriculture. With the mechanization of agriculture and the industrialization and urbanization, the locus of production moved from the home farm to the market, to the cities. And these were sort of female unfriendly for a number of reasons. So this describes the initial decline in female participation. The later increase was explained to some extent by increased education among women, by the development of the service economy, and the availability of clerical jobs that were perceived to be more appropriate for women as opposed to manufacturing jobs. So we contribute to this work by harmonizing data sources for the earlier period. So we hope to bring together a harmonized series for working hours and employment, of course, since 1880. So the hours start in 1880, employment starts in 1870, and we formalize the link between gender trends and the changing industry structure in a unified framework. Now, there is also some more recent work. This is how this work started. For example, Rachel and myself have earlier work on the interplay between female employment and the industry structure. This work here typically focuses, not just Rachel and myself, there's few other papers. This work focuses on the later decades, in which the main force was the increase in services and the increase in female employment. Now, this work does have a unified framework, it does have rich data, but it tells very little about the decline in female employment in the early days. So if one just looks at this work, one may think that given that the service share has been going up for a lot more than we can study, perhaps even female employment has been going up for more than we can study. And here we argue that no, it's really important to look at the earlier decades and in particular the role of agriculture. So the perspective on the earlier work, we argue, is valuable not just to understand the gender trends in the long run, but also perhaps to bring some insight into the experiences of some developing countries these days who are going now through the phases of agricultural decline and decline in female participation. Okay, so let me move on to the data, which is probably the main contribution of what we do. So let me start with employment. So this is just bodies, extensive margin. What we want to do here is to work with what is now accepted as the sort of ILO definition of employment, which covers work for pay, profit, or family gain in cash or kind. So the current definition of employment is producing anything that brings income home. So either because you're an employee in an outside firm, or you produce on the family farm without earning a wage, but you sell it to the market. Now, this definition is now established, but the measurement is not entirely consistent, and in particular, in the US Census, which is what we use for the earlier decades, this definition didn't exist until 1940. So before 1940, employment was just gainful employment, so employment with a paid occupation. But even so, even that was not consistent, because before 1940, there were some attempts by the census and the enumerators to capture some unpaid work, when this was done with some important qualifications regularly, most of the time, maybe at least a certain number of hours per week, okay? From 1940 onwards, the census adopts the definition of ILO employment, so there is unpaid work in the census, but again, unpaid work is not measured consistently, and again is measured with relatively restrictive definition, more restricting than what you would use for market employment. So for example, if you're hired and you receive a wage, you're classified if you're working any positive number of hours, even 1 hour is sufficient to put you into employment. If you're unpaid, you would be classified as employed if you work at least, for example, 15 hours per week. So the definition is not consistent. So there is a challenge here, because the problem is identifying unpaid family work before 1940, which is precisely when this was more widespread. So we need to borrow from other sources, we need to borrow from other definitions. Now, before we go into adjustments of this data, how large is the undercount of female work in the census, and why does that matter? Why is that important? So one key idea that is reflected in many historical papers is that the instructions contained in the early census surveys reflected inevitably some social attitudes about women's employment. So the enumerators were actually sort of instructed implicitly or explicitly to think twice before classifying a woman as employed. Is she earning a wage? Is she working regularly? What is she doing? Unless she ticks all these boxes, this person should be classified as a homemaker. So, to give you a very simple example, in 1890 in the US, doesn't matter, 1890, about 40% of the population lived on farms. Nearly half of the population was on the farm. And on the farms, there were about 4 million white married women. So 4 million white married women living on farms. Only 23,000 were enumerated into agricultural occupations. So what was everyone else doing? Okay. Now, in 1950, the population on farms fell by about 3 times to 14%. But the number of unpaid family workers enumerated as employed has increased by 10 times. So there is a very important difference here in the way in which women are classified in or out of the labor force. So basically what we learned from the early decades is that there is no way to capture female employment simply by the definition provided by the census. So why is it important to capture this? So there is one distinction that we want to build clearly in what we do, which is this distinction between unpaid market work and other stuff that you do without receiving a wage, for example, home production, for example, leisure. So leisure, we all understand what it is. You're not expecting to receive a wage for that. Home production is services that you produce at home, like cleaning the home, cooking meals, looking after children. Basically, this is stuff that you produce for your own consumption. Unpaid market work, like work on the family business, work on the family farm, contributes to family income. So there is a clear definition, there is a clear distinction in national accounts. The first is employment, the second is not. So there is a distinction about measurement. If we want to characterize female employment and gender gaps, we need to focus on the overall definition of employment, which includes unpaid work, but not home production. So this is also important to avoid the mismeasuring of agricultural productivity, because you would massively underestimate the denominator when you compute productivity if you don't include unpaid work, and also for understanding structural transformation. But it's not just a matter of measurement. There is also a more sort of conceptual, substantial matter about the distinction between the consequences of working for some sort of income and working for own consumption. So when people work to sell produce on the market, they may accumulate different skills, they can build networks, and there is evidence, for example, this very famous paper by Alessina et al. On the adoption of the plows, that working the family farm was more conducive to female emancipation, female empowerment, the long-run evolution of gender norms, than having women relegated at home, looking after children, cooking and cleaning. So there is also a conceptual distinction between the two. So what we do, The first step that we take is borrowing from a historian and demographer, Ruggles, who highlighted immensely the importance of family farms and also family businesses more in general throughout the 19th century and the mid-20th century. So the idea is that production was largely carried out by families, so there is this idea of family enterprises, and all family members that were old enough to work were contributing to farm production. And this also applied to farm businesses, to non-farm businesses. You can think, for example, about small businesses like shoemakers, tailors, repairs, boarding houses, etc. So we use microdata at the household level to adjust the census estimate of female employment in the following way. So we assign to the labor force women on the farm, living on the farm, whose head of household is a farmer, whether or not they report on occupation. So the idea is that if you are a woman living on the farm, married to a self-employed farmer, the presumption is that you're not just enjoying leisure and cooking all week. You're gonna chip in the family work, in the farm work. Now, Ruggles extend this method also to non-farm families in which the head is self-employed. We do that with some robustness tests. This doesn't change much. The really important adjustment is the one about the family farm. Okay, so this is what we get. I won't say much about men because, of course, this adjustment doesn't mean much about men. There are very few men that are not receiving a wage married to a self-employed female farmer. So basically for men, adjusted or unadjusted employment rates are the same, around 90%. For women, there is a big difference here. So basically, the gainful occupation employment is extremely low, between 10 and 20%. Before World War II, and then increases in the second part of the century. And if you adjust for the proportion of women who are not receiving a wage, but they're living on a farm, married to a self-employed farmer, you have a huge increase in employment, which is precisely capturing this idea of unpaid employment. So this is what the U is showing. So first a decline from 57% down to 45% in mid-century, and then up again to 77% at the end of the sample period. Now, if you look closely here, what happens in 1910, there is a blip in the original series, because in 1910, the enumerators were trying something different in order to capture women working as unpaid. And as you can see, this blip is a bit smaller, but is still there in the adjusted series. In the sense, this means that basically the women that were included in employment here are not simply the sort of women living on farms married to a self-employed farmer. There was some other category included in 1910 that we cannot really capture here. So this is the adjusted employment rate, and this is what people refer to as the U-shape. Now, this looks inside the U-shape. What is driving the U-shape? Well, basically, the decline in female employment is entirely driven by the decline in the family farms. So this kind of mint green wedge represents unpaid work in agriculture. So the whole decline is driven by this. And the whole increase here, this big orange section, is the rise in services. So this is already flagging that it's important to look at the industry structure. Now, most importantly, we need to do a lot more on the intensive margin. The intensive margin is extremely important because for what we look at, there are very important differences in working hours along two dimensions. The most important dimension is overtime, and the other very important dimension is between paid and unpaid work. So employment in 1900 is not the same thing as employment in 1950 in terms of working hours. So first of all, working hours fell substantially for all non-farm employees. So the work week in the 1880s was 60 hours per week, down to 40 hours per week in 1940. And it has remained more or less like that after having included, for example, sick pay or holiday pay. But it's a huge decline from 60 to 40 weeks. And even more striking, perhaps, is the difference between paid hours and unpaid hours. So there is a very early survey of farm laborers from the 1870 that shows that what those farm laborers, these are employees, were working per day between 10 and 14 hours was close to what in 1920s homemakers were working as unpaid workers on the family farm per week. So these are hours per day paid These are hours per week, unpaid. So it's a huge difference. So we can't simply bring women into the labor force because they're married to a self-employed farmer as sort of 100% bodies because they're only working a fraction of the work week. So what do we do about hours? There is no systematic source for working hours before 1940. So we bring together all possible existing evidence coming from several sources, different sectors of the economy, different states, different purposes, different studies, in order to sort of populate the atlas of working hours before 1940. So one key source is the historical statistics of the US, which starts in 1860 up to 1930, and this itself is drawing from other several surveys, the Census of Manufacturers, and many other reports quoted there, which were mostly serving the manufacturing sector. Actually, the coverage for manufacturing is fairly good. And the reason is unsurprising, because the manufacturing sector was the first section of the economy that introduced structured work weeks, structured length, structured schedule, so it was easier basically to account for working hours. So the coverage of the manufacturing sector is actually quite good, and it's disaggregated by gender from 1914. There is very little on services here, or nothing at all. For services, we found this amazing survey, this amazing source, which is a collection of many state-level studies that were studies commissioned by state-level bureaus of labor, looking, for example, at teachers in a certain state, or, for example, postal workers in another state, lots of different sectors. They were not always nationally representative. So basically, the complete data set covers most sectors of the economy, little by little, for a total of 100,000 workers in 14 states. So this is what we have on paid hours outside manufacturing. So the beauty of this data set is actually we have individual data. We can compute the gender pay gap, for example, in the late 19th century. In our sample, we use about 75,000 observations, because for the others, we don't have the hours, in 12 states. We cover 3 sectors, so these data cover all 3 sectors of the economy, but unsurprisingly, evidence is very thin on agriculture, because agriculture by itself was not lending to a precise measurement of working hours. The work week depended on the season, on the weather, on the daylight, etc. So this stops in 1901. And then for the later period, there is a very rich collection of studies on working women at Harvard University Library. It's called the Women Working Project. So it's extremely rich, because it's not just quantitative evidence, it's also a lot of qualitative reports. The problem is that, as the title says, it's mostly about women. So there is very little coverage about men, but luckily there is some scant statistics on men for comparison purposes. So we put everything together. This all fits in one slide, but it was months of digitization and harmonization. And then from 1940 onwards, we can use the US Census. So putting things together, actually, before we put things together, I just want to give you an idea of what the data on hours look like in those early studies. So this is the late 19th century, and this is the distribution of individual hours in manufacturing and services for men and women. As you can see, there is a bit of dispersion, but there is a clear mode at 60 hours per week. Everywhere, men, women, manufacturing and services. There is also in agriculture, 60 hours here, although this distribution is very sparse. We have very few observations on agriculture. Okay, putting everything together, this is what we have. So remember, these are paid hours per employee, so there is no zeros. Everybody's in work here. So paid hours fall for both men and women from very high numbers, between 60 and 70 per week. They fall throughout to mid-20th century, and then they remain roughly stable. There are no major differences between men and women. There are no major differences across sectors. Okay, this is the wage ratio. So again, putting together various sources. This is about the wage ratio in manufacturing, around 57%. This is the wage ratio from the microdata, just over 60%. This is bringing in the census. So various data, various definition, various sectors of the economy. Perhaps we can summarize this picture by saying there wasn't really any clear trend in the wage ratio up until 1970, and after that, the rest is history. We all know what was the wage convergence between men and women. Unpaid hours. This is really important because we need to put a number on female employment in the early days. So the most important source of unpaid hours for us were these so-called Pernal diaries, which were covering the period between 1920s and 1950s. So these started with the 1925 Pernal Act, which commissioned a nationally representative survey of the US Department of Agriculture across American homemakers. So the purpose of this survey was to cover the working conditions and the lives of American homemakers that were predominantly rural. So nationally representative, but is focusing on a certain demographic group. Non-employed women, so women who are not earning a wage, living in rural environments, which is great for us to measure unpaid hours of rural homemakers, but is less great if we want to expand beyond that. Okay? This survey was replicated across several states, and we have a combined sample of about 4,000 women across 35 states. What do we get from these surveys? So, from the Pernal diaries, we find that hours spent by homemakers in farm work in springtime, because we need to compare them to the census that was surveyed in spring, were 15 in 1920s and 1930s, 12 in the 1940s, 7.5 in the 1950s. We argue that this is by far a lower bound for the true hours that these people were spending in the farm. One reason is because these diaries tended to oversample sort of middle-class, more educated women. And one simple reason, if you look, this is a sort of time-use diary that was used in 1929. And as you can see, so you basically have to fill in this time-use diary by hand, of course. So you have the morning, and the morning is a circle with 144 little sectors. Each little sector represents 5 minutes, so you need to have some numeracy skills, you need to have some literacy skills. So for example, you fill in those sectors, preparing breakfast, eating breakfast, working in the field, etc., AM and PM. So clearly this oversamples educated women. Another reason why this might be an underestimate is because, of course, homemakers were surveyed on the farm, and then in very busy seasons, say in harvest season, they were less likely to be sort of idle at home waiting for the numerator. So you might be missing women who are like working full week because it's harvest season. And also these hours do not include the time that is necessary, for example, to cater for farm laborers. So if the farm had external employees and those employees were eating on the farm, they were lodged on the farm, the hours spent by the homemaker to cater for family employees, which were about like 2.5 hours, would also be part of the hours spent in order to produce agricultural output. So we argue this is a lower bound, but then what is a realistic upper bound? We have nothing else, basically. The only thing that we can use is the US Census, but remember the US Census has information on unpaid hours from the 1940s. So in 1940 and 1950, unpaid hours on the farm were on average 33 per week, so much higher than that. This 33 per week is about 93% of full-time hours in the paid sector. So basically we are talking about something that goes from, say, 15 to 32. It's a relatively large band in which we cannot really say all that much. So we have to be sort of conservative and consider a whole band of plausible estimates. Okay, so this is the band. So basically, these are market hours per person, including extensive and intensive margins. So this also includes the zeros because it considers the employment rate. So over time, as you can see, women were working very little in paid agriculture. They were also working very little in manufacturing. They were working sort of intermediate hours and services and then shooting up in the second half of the 20th century. They were working a lot in unpaid agriculture. This is basically the band between the upper and the lower bound, and these hours declined to basically zero towards the mid-20th century. So if you put everything together, the envelope is this kind of U-shape, and this U-shape here is new because we haven't seen a U-shape using working hours. The problem with working hours is that, okay, there is a lot of uncertainty here. If you take the lower bound, the U shape is really kind of asymmetric and very shallow initially, because we are saying, okay, these guys are working 15 and then 12 hours. If we take the upper bound, it resembles very much the extensive margin, because the upper bound of working hours is basically a full-time week. So this is the U in working hours. For men, there isn't any U, for the reasons I've said before, and also there is very little uncertainty between the upper and lower bound, because there is very little unpaid work in agriculture. There is a monotonic decrease in working hours from about 60 to about 35 these days, okay? Okay. The last bit of data that we do is about obtaining home production hours. We say another important process is the transition from home services to market services. For the later period, we'd use harmonized time use surveys that are very well sort of used and very well known. For the earlier period, we'd use the parental diaries, because those diaries were not only capturing the time spent on the farm, but the time spent on anything. The problem here, however, is that we want the time spent on home production by any demographic group. Non-working women, working women, men, and mostly we can cover non-working women. So what we get in terms of estimates, and again, this is the part on which we have fewer data, is basically this kind of convergence in home hours in the second part of the 20th century, and not much going on in the previous period, but I should say that the previous period was mostly based on predictions and extrapolation. So this is not something that we really claim that we can make a contribution upon. Okay, summary of the evidence, just to wrap up. We emphasize the role of unpaid work for women. This is key to understand women's involvement in the economy until mid-20th century. Female employment is U-shaped. 1940 is the turning point. Also, female hours are U-shaped, but much more sort of asymmetric and shallow. Male hours are falling throughout. There is gender convergence in home hours. The wage rate is essentially constant until about 1970, and then it's rising. And then we bring in a framework that put these things together. Why do we want a unified framework? Well, first of all, we want to understand whether there can be a sort of single story that explains sort of converging and then diverging trends. And then we want to try to put some numbers to see whether indeed this framework has explanatory power on the trends that we estimate. So we have a model economy with households and firms. Households derive utility from the consumption of agricultural output, manufacturing, and services. These three goods are gross complement in utility. So these are very bad substitutes for one another. You want to consume a variety. Moreover, on agricultural consumption, there is a subsistence requirement. There is a minimum amount of food that you need to eat. And this is generating income effects, because it means that the share of agricultural consumption shrinks when the economy grows. The market sectors are agriculture, manufacturing, and services. These are the key assumptions. Productivity growth is uneven, is largest in agriculture and possibly manufacturing, but most importantly, is larger in agriculture than in services, whether in the home or in the market. And female intensity, conversely, is higher in services than in agriculture or manufacturing. So these are the assumptions we build in the model, and this will be validated by the data. The family farms are part of the agricultural sector. The output is sold to the market, belongs to GDP. Home production is producing home services like childcare and cleaning that are close substitute to similar market services. Okay? In home production, which is part of the big service sector, there is lower productivity growth than in the market service sector, because the market service sector can better implement innovation, technology adoption, economies of scale, which do not happen inside the home. So firms, it's very simple. In every sector, you have exactly the same production function. There is only labor. So output in sector J is produced using labor with a productivity factor AJ, which is going to be key, because this is growing over time at a rate that differs across sectors. Then labor is a sort of CES aggregator of female labor and male labor, where XI represents the technological parameter associated to women in sector J, so this can represent comparative advantages, sector intensities, even social norms, and eta is the elasticity of substitution. So remember, this AJ parameter is growing at a sector-specific rate, gamma J. And psi j are sector-specific gender weights. The labor markets are competitive, there is free mobility, so the wage ratio between men and women is the same across all sectors. Households consume goods from agriculture, manufacturing, and services. I'm calling services Z because this is a compound service sector that is including home services and market services. It's a CES utility function. This is representing, in a strong eerie sense, the kind of minimum food that you need to consume in order to survive. So this is what generates non-homotheticity in the utility function. This is manufacturing, and this is total services. There is an elasticity of substitution epsilon, which we argue it's very small, because you don't want to substitute computers for childcare services. So epsilon is close to 0, but what we need is that it's less than 1, and C bar, of course, this minimum consumption is greater than 0. Total services Z are a bundle of home-produced childcare and market-produced childcare. And these two things, home and market, are good substitutes, so this sigma is strictly greater than 1. Okay, how do you produce home services in exactly the same way as you produce market services? It's again the same CES utility function, and then this is the leisure which is enjoyed by the household. Now, the assumptions, just to state the assumptions formally, the comparative advantage assumption means that the gender intensity in home and market services is higher than in manufacturing and agriculture. And then productivity growth is higher in market services than in home services because of economies of scale and technology adoption. But in services, market services is lower than both in agriculture and manufacturing. And we will have data on that. So the results of the model are all analytic. We don't need numerical results for the qualitative implications, can all be derived based on the relative expenditure shares. So this result is telling me that over time, the relative expenditure in market services relative to home services evolve according to how this ratio here evolves. This is the ratio between productivity in market services and productivity in home services. This number is increasing over time. This is rising faster than this. As these two things are good substitutes for one another, sigma is greater than 1. So if you have two sectors of the economy, market services and home services, one is becoming much more efficient at producing similar services. Let's just move production to that sector. So over time, the share of market services increases relative to the share of home services. And now we can make similar arguments for the relative shares of agriculture and services or manufacturing and market services. So between agriculture and services, we have two effects now. One is the productivity differential. So this ratio is increasing over time. Productivity growth is much faster in agriculture than in services. But these two things are poor substitutes. Epsilon is less than 1. So it means that simply it's not that you're substituting services to agriculture. Agriculture is a lot more efficient. You just need less people working in agriculture. So agriculture sheds labor out of the sector. So this is the uneven productivity growth effect. And then there is an additional effect here coming from the income effect. Over time, the share of the minimum consumption requirement relative to agricultural output is shrinking with agricultural growth. So this is going to matter less and less over time. Both effects imply a reduction of the agricultural share relative to the service share. 10 minutes. Okay. So labor reallocation in this model, just to recap, structural transformation happens when, for example, faster productivity growth in agriculture and subsistence consumption reallocate labors away from agriculture. This happens through income effects, the share of agricultural expenditure shrinks, and through substitution effect via consumption complementarity, because agriculture and services are poor substitutes. For the same reason, you can compare manufacturing and services. Productivity growth is higher in manufacturing than services. These things are poor substitutes. Over time, you shed labor from manufacturing into services. And then you have marketization. And as home and market services are good substitutes, faster productivity growth in market services simply reallocates labor from home to market services. What does it mean over time? In the first phase of economic development, let's say 19th century up to mid-20th century, initially there is a very large agricultural sector. So structural transformation is very important. There is a very large sector in which technology adoption and productivity growth is very fast. What happens, structural transformation is the main force. Marketization is very much not important in the initial period. So there is agricultural decline. Agriculture sheds labor into everything else. Everything else means leisure, means home services, means market services, means manufacturing. But the most important point is that the decline in agriculture is so strong that market hours in this economy fall, all things together, because there is a big increase in leisure and an increase in home production. Both male and female hours decline. They were both working a lot in agriculture. Agriculture is shrinking. What is the role of manufacturing in the early phase? It depends on the differential between these two growth rates. We can argue what it is. It doesn't really matter for what we are doing about women. It only matters about men. The later phase is starting mid-20th century, and this is mostly about marketization and the rise in services. So mid-20th century, the agricultural sector is very small. So the decline in agriculture is not really driving anything much. The subsistence consumption is also very small because, of course, the economy is a lot richer. So if there is some structural transformation, this is limited to the reallocation from manufacturing into service. One important thing is that now there is a large service share, overall services, and those services are becoming marketized quite fast because productivity growth is stronger in the market than in the home. So market services rise and home production falls, okay? Why does that have differential gender impacts? Because market services are very intensive in female labor, as well as home services are also very intensive in female labor. So this implies an increase in female market hours. So this is the upward branch of the U. By contrast, manufacturing is intensive in male labor. So male hours fall, reflecting the industrialization, which is not offset entirely by the rise in services. So basically, we have a completely gender-neutral shock, which is uneven productivity growth, which translates into differential gender trends due to differential sector intensities. Now, how long do I have?
Now 7 minutes.
Excluding the questions? Or including the questions?
No, excluding. Then we have 10 minutes for questions.
Okay.
We have 7 minutes to finish.
Okay, that's great. So this is what the model gives qualitatively. And then what we want to see is whether there is a plausible combination of parameters. We're not going to be sort of dead set on some particular values of those parameters. We just ask you whether there is any sort of plausible combination of those parameters that replicate the trends that we predict in the model in the same way as we've estimated in the data. So basically, the model, I haven't gone into much more detail, but it gives analytical solutions for sort of the outcomes that we care about. And now, having gotten those results, we want to see whether it's easy to replicate the kind of U-shape in female hours, and in particular, whether we can replicate the location of the turning point of the U. So to do that, we sort of quantify the various elements of the model. So the key elements are structural transformation and marketization. In order to quantify that, we need data on gender intensity within sectors and sectoral level productivity growth. But also there is other stuff that goes on in the model. Of course, there are the gender-specific parameters, the XI, that also change enormously over time, because XI basically capture within sector changes in gender intensity. And this changed a lot because, for example, comparative advantages, that women had a higher comparative advantage in services rather than manufacturing because of more physical strength being needed in manufacturing, was probably true in the 1950s, is much less true this day. Because there has been some gender-specific increase in productivity due to higher human capital investment among women than among men, or because societal norms about female work in different sectors have changed dramatically. So of course there has been a big shift in this kind of gender-specific within sector parameters. Okay? So we can talk about gender-biased technological change, compositional change, evolution in gender norms. And then there are also some small sort of endowment changes, population changes, but these do not matter much. So these are basically the two main forces between sector and within sector. The calibration is basically as simple as possible, so it's as frugal as possible. So we borrow some elasticity parameters from existing calibration. So the eta, the elasticity between men and women, the sigma, the elasticity between home services and market services, and the epsilon, the elasticity between agriculture, manufacturing, and services, are borrowed from other work. Importantly, we have productivity growth estimates from the data. So the gamma J, we can estimate from some available data. And in the calibration, what we do, we match exactly the allocation in the middle, well, towards the later part of the sample period. So we match exactly the allocation in 1950, and this is done to match the values of these kind of gender intensities in the 1950 and the levels of productivity in 1950. And then we assess the performance of the model quantitatively by looking at predictions before and after 1950. So before and after 1950, productivity growth implies different values for this productivity level. The changes in gender-specific demand implies different values of those psi parameters. So what is the model doing before and after 1950? These are all the calibrated parameters. So one important thing here, these gamma values, they come from the Bureau of Economic Activity estimates for the period 1950 to 2020. There is a huge issue here. What do we do before 1950? Before 1950, there is very little, for example, actually before 1920, there is very little on agricultural productivity growth. So we have some scant estimates of agricultural productivity growth towards the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, which are smaller than 3.6%. So in a sense, we do some robustness analysis in the paper about that. I can tell you what is the impact of that. But importantly, in this kind of benchmark calibration, what we get from the BEA is basically what we were assuming. So the productivity growth is highest in agriculture, 3.6%, middle in manufacturing, 2.5%, and lowest in market services, 1.4%. And in home services, we are using the estimates of Ben Bridgman. We get something that is smallest than everything, which is 0.6%. So this is basically what we have embodied into our assumptions. Okay. The other interesting bit that I would like to show, these are the gender-specific parameters, and this is their evolution over time. So the orange one is the sector intensity in services, green is agriculture, blue is manufacturing. In line with other assumptions, gender intensity is highest in market services, and it's also increasing the most in market services. In manufacturing and agriculture, gender intensity is lower, as you would expect. Okay. This is what would be predicted by all the forces in our model about the sector shares. So putting together changes in index I, putting together an even productivity growth, how do we reproduce the evolution of agriculture, manufacturing, and service share? So the model is matched perfectly in 1950, by definition. Before 1950, the model replicates really well the decline in agriculture, and nothing is matched here. So this is purely based on the productivity growth that we measure in the data. The model also predicts the rise in services and this kind of hump shape in manufacturing, but with some like overestimate for manufacturing, underestimate for services. So qualitatively, things work better than quantitatively. This is about gender trends. So this is all the forces together. What do they imply for gender trends? The dotted line is the data. The solid line is the model. So basically, the model reproduces the U, including the bottom of the U around 1940, 1950. And it reproduces the monotonic decline for men. Now, one thing, the model sort of underpredicts the decline for men and perhaps overpredict the decline for women. But what is more importantly for what we do in terms of our main forces of structural transformation and marketization, here what we do for both men and women, we look at the data, so the data is the dotted line, and then we have these three other lines that represent each force in isolation. So the solid line here represents structural transformation and marketization. So this could be the only force that generates the fall in female hours in the early period. There is no other force in this economy that can generate that. In particular, if you look, for example, at gender-specific factors within sector, if anything, they produce constant or even rising female hours. So this kind of intersectoral reallocation is the only thing that can explain the fall in female hours in the first part of the sample. In the second part of the sample, Inter-industry structure only explains part, like about 25% of the rise in female hours. The biggest share is explained by changes in gender intensity within sectors. For men, things are fairly similar. The big decline can only be explained by the decline in agricultural sector and even productivity growth. The later decline, however, is explained in roughly equal proportion by, well, slightly higher the decline in the demand for men within sector and the decline in the manufacturing sector. So we conclude that the forces that we model explain the whole decline in male and female hours up until 1950, and about 25% of the increase in female hour and the reduction in male hours after that. So let me just leave a conclusion slide in terms of sort of what lessons we can learn from the historical evidence. Perhaps I should stop here, leave that slide there, and if there are questions, of course, I'm happy to go back to this one.
Okay.